Ma'am, I'm going to need you to change seats, now. Captain Michael Reynolds' voice cut through the ambient hum of the first-class cabin, his tone brooking no argument. Alexis Turner looked up from her tablet, maintaining the calm demeanor that had carried her through 2 decades in aviation. Her eyes met the captain's, steady and unflinching. "No," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I am in my assigned seat." The single syllable hung in the air. Passengers nearby froze mid-conversation. A flight attendant paused while stowing a carry-on. The predictable rhythm of pre-flight procedures stuttered to a halt. Captain Reynolds blinked clearly, not expecting resistance. His jaw tightened beneath his perfectly trimmed salt and pepper beard. "This isn't a request," he said louder now. "It's an operational necessity." Alexis placed her tablet on the armrest, straightened in her seat, and replied with measured precision. "Then you'll need to explain the specific operational necessity that requires me and only me to relocate from my assigned seat." A ripple of murmurs spread through the first-class cabin. A businessman in 3A glanced up from his laptop. An elderly woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly. A young man in the second row reached subtly for his phone. In that moment, what should have been a routine boarding procedure on Transamerica Flight 847 transformed into something else entirely, the opening move in a confrontation that would change the airline industry forever. Alexis Turner hadn't planned on making history today. At 38, the former commercial pilot turned Federal Aviation Safety Commissioner had boarded enough flights to recognize the familiar choreography of air travel. The weight of her credentials hidden beneath the simple designation of her title remained her own private knowledge as she settled into seat 3B. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit, comfortable yet professional, with a small golden pin on her lapel, the wings she'd earned as a pilot 15 years earlier. Her natural hair was styled in a neat crown of twists, and her only jewelry was a pair of small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother Eliza. In her leather messenger bag, nestled between legal briefs and her tablet, sat a small bound journal with Accountability Protocol embossed in gold on its cover. The journal, now on its 3rd volume, documented every instance of discrimination she'd encountered or witnessed in her extensive travels. Each entry meticulously recorded dates, times, locations, and names. It was both shield and sword protection against gaslighting and evidence when needed. Alexis hadn't always been prepared. At 19, as a sophomore at Howard University studying aviation management, she'd experienced the humiliation of being forced to move from her assigned seat on a Greyhound bus, despite having a valid ticket. The driver had claimed a weight distribution issue, yet 3 white passengers who boarded after her were seated exactly where she'd been told to move from. She'd complied then, burning with quiet anger and shame, vowing it would never happen again. That incident had shaped her career path. After becoming one of the youngest commercial pilots in the country, she'd earned a law degree at night while flying days. When a landing injury temporarily grounded her, she'd transitioned to aviation safety policy, eventually securing an appointment to the Federal Aviation Safety Commission. Today's flight was taking her to Los Angeles to testify before a congressional committee on passenger rights and airline accountability, a subject she'd dedicated her career to addressing. The irony of facing discrimination on this particular journey wasn't lost on her, as Captain Reynolds loomed over her seat. Alexis recalled her grandmother's words, "When they try to move you, that's exactly when you need to stand your ground." Eliza Turner had marched with Dr. King, had integrated lunch counters, had taught her granddaughter that dignity wasn't negotiable. Alexis took a deep breath, centered herself, and reached for her Accountability Protocol journal. This wasn't just about one seat on one flight. This was about patterns of behavior that continued because too many people remained silent. She wasn't flying as a commissioner today. This wasn't an official inspection. But years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs, the subtle glances from crew members, the whispered consultations, the sudden operational necessity that somehow applied only to her. As her fingers touched the leather cover of her journal, Alexis made a decision. Whatever happened next, she would document everything. Not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been asked to move without cause. Transamerica Flight 847 was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the airline's newest additions to its transcontinental fleet. The first-class cabin gleamed with understated luxury, 12 spacious seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each with direct aisle access. Ambient lighting cast a warm golden hue that would transition to cool blue once at cruising altitude, designed to minimize jet lag on the 5.5-hour journey from JFK to LAX. At 7:15 p.m., the evening departure was running precisely on schedule. Through the oval windows, the setting sun painted the tarmac in amber and long shadows. The familiar scent of new upholstery mixed with subtle notes of coffee from the galley where flight attendants prepared welcome beverages. Alexis occupied seat 3B, a middle seat on the port side with a vacant window seat beside her. Across the aisle in 3C sat James Wilson, a white businessman in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair and a bespoke suit. His focus remained fixed on his laptop, though his eyes occasionally darted toward the unfolding tension. Elena Rodriguez moved efficiently through the cabin, the 33-year-old flight attendant, checking each passenger's comfort with practiced ease. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her Transamerica uniform impeccably pressed. When she reached Alexis, her smile seemed genuine, unlike the strained politeness she'd offered to several other passengers. In seat 2D, Tyler Hammond, a white executive with the bearing of someone accustomed to first-class travel, watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. His sighs grew increasingly audible as boarding continued his glances at his watch, performative displays of impatience. Sophia Diaz, a 72-year-old Hispanic woman with silver-streaked black hair and dignity in her posture, occupied seat 4B. She observed the cabin with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had witnessed decades of history unfold. When her eyes met Alexis's briefly, something like recognition passed between them, not of faces, but of experiences. The remaining first-class passengers, primarily white businessmen with the occasional woman among them, created a familiar demographic pattern Alexis had seen countless times. In the fourth row, a group of college students had been upgraded, their excited whispers and occasional phone checks contrasting with the studied indifference of frequent flyers. Senior flight attendant Gregory Palmer, a tall white man in his early 40s with a military-precise bearing, supervised the boarding process from the galley, occasionally consulting a tablet and whispering instructions to Elena. His glances toward Alexis carried something beyond the professional courtesy he showed other passengers, a hint of evaluation, perhaps even scrutiny. The aircraft hummed with pre-departure energy, the low conversations of passengers, the thud of overhead bins closing the occasional ping of the call button, and beneath it all the subtle vibration of auxiliary power units maintaining cabin comfort before engine start. Through these familiar sounds, Alexis detected something else, the particular quality of whispers that indicated she was being discussed. After years of navigating predominantly white professional spaces, she recognized the shift in atmosphere that preceded an incident. The cabin was comfortable, but the air was growing heavy with unspoken tension. Alexis first noticed the change 20 minutes before departure. Elena Rodriguez and Gregory Palmer exchanged glances after reviewing something on the crew tablet, a subtle widening of Elena's eyes, a quick shake of Gregory's head. They thought they were being discreet, but Alexis had spent years reading such micro-expressions. When Elena approached with Alexis's pre-flight water, her smile seemed fixed. "Everything comfortable, Ms. Turner?" Elena asked, her voice professionally pleasant, but her eyes flickering toward the galley where Gregory watched. "Very comfortable, thank you," Alexis replied, accepting the water. "Is there something concerning about my seat assignment? I noticed some consultation about the manifest." Elena's composure flickered. "No, everything's fine. Just routine checks." But it wasn't routine, Alexis knew that. As Elena moved to the next passenger, Alexis glimpsed the crew tablet briefly. A passenger manifest was visible with a small flag icon beside seat 3B. The notation, PC verification, appeared in red. 3 minutes later, Gregory whispered into his communication device, "We have a code adjustment in 3B. Captain's been notified." Code adjustment. Alexis had never heard that specific term in her years of aviation, but the pattern was familiar. Airlines often developed internal language for passenger classification, ostensibly for service optimization, but sometimes serving less savory purposes. From her peripheral vision, she noticed James Wilson shift in his seat, his attention now divided between his laptop and the crew's movements. He too had noticed something off. Sophia Diaz caught Alexis's eye briefly, a knowing look that communicated volumes. The older woman's slight nod conveyed solidarity. Through the forward galley, Alexis spotted the cockpit door opening. The first officer remained at the controls, while Captain Reynolds, tall, authoritative, with the confident bearing of someone who'd commanded aircraft for decades, stepped into the cabin. This was unusual. Captains typically remained in the cockpit during boarding, emerging only for technical issues or to welcome VIP passengers. Reynolds consulted briefly with Gregory, their voices too low to hear, but their body language clear. The captain glanced toward Alexis, his expression hardening slightly. Gregory handed him the tablet, pointing to something on the screen. "Code status verified," Gregory said, just loud enough for Alexis to catch. "Adjustment recommended." "I'll handle it," Reynolds replied. From the row behind her, Alexis heard Tyler Hammond mutter something about getting this show on the road. 2 first-class passengers who had boarded after Alexis were welcomed, warmly escorted to their seats without the scrutiny she'd received. Alexis quietly removed her accountability protocol journal from her bag. As she opened to a fresh page, she noted the date, flight number, and initial observations. This wasn't her first encounter with differential treatment, but something about the formality of the approach, the codes, the captain's involvement suggested an established pattern rather than an isolated incident. When Captain Reynolds began walking toward her seat, Alexis was already prepared. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs long before confrontation became inevitable. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to change seats, now." Captain Reynolds stood beside 3B, his voice carrying an authority accustomed to instant compliance. "No," Alexis replied. "I am in my assigned seat." The captain's momentary surprise gave way to a firmer stance. "This isn't a request," he said. "It's an operational necessity." Alexis maintained eye contact. "Then you'll need to explain the specific operational necessity that requires me and only me to relocate from my assigned seat." Reynolds glanced at nearby passengers, lowering his voice slightly. "We have a weight distribution requirement for this aircraft. Your cooperation is required for safe operation." Alexis had spent 15 years flying commercial aircraft. Weight distribution was indeed critical, but it was calculated based on passenger count, not individual seat assignments within the same cabin class. "Captain," she replied, her voice quiet but carrying to nearby seats. "Weight distribution on a 787 is calculated by zone, not by specific seats within the same cabin. First class is a single zone for weight and balance purposes." A flicker of surprise crossed Reynolds' face. Passengers weren't supposed to know such technical details. Behind him, Elena Rodriguez froze in the aisle, a look of discomfort evident on her face. "Ma'am, I'm the captain of this aircraft. Aircraft safety is my determination to make." "Of course it is," Alexis agreed. "And I would never question legitimate safety procedures. I'm simply requesting the specific regulation you're implementing that requires me to move while leaving all other passengers in first class in their assigned seats." From seat 3A, James Wilson looked up fully, now his laptop forgotten. Other passengers had grown quiet, sensing the tension. Captain Reynolds shifted strategies. "We have a VIP passenger who needs this specific seat. We can move you to 7A in business class, a courtesy upgrade from your original booking." Alexis raised an eyebrow. My boarding pass indicates I was assigned 3B at booking. This wasn't an upgrade. And if there's a VIP requiring specific seating, shouldn't that have been arranged prior to boarding? From behind, Tyler Hammond interjected loudly, "Some of us have connections to make. Is this really necessary? Just move and let's get going." Several other passengers muttered in agreement, creating a small chorus of disapproval directed at Alexis. "See?" Reynolds said, seizing the opportunity. "You're delaying an entire aircraft full of people with important commitments." Alexis didn't turn to acknowledge Hammond. Her focus remained on the captain, whose jaw had tightened visibly. "Final call, ma'am. Either relocate voluntarily, or we'll need to escalate this situation." The threat hung in the air. Several passengers now openly watched the exchange. From the corner of her eye, Alexis noticed one of the college students in row 4 discreetly angling a phone toward the confrontation. Alexis placed her open journal on her lap, pen poised. "Captain Reynolds," she said, reading his name from his uniform. "I'll need your employee number for my records." "My what?" Reynolds blinked. "Your employee number. Since you're implementing a non-standard seating policy based on claimed operational necessity, I'll need to document the specific directive and authorizing personnel." Gregory Palmer stepped forward. "Ma'am, recording crew information is not permitted." "Incorrect," Alexis interrupted calmly. "FAA Regulation 14 CFR 121.548 specifically permits passengers to request identification from any crew member implementing safety directives. If this is indeed a safety directive, I'm within my rights to document it." A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin. Captain Reynolds' expression darkened. The confrontation had just escalated beyond what he'd clearly anticipated. "Ma'am, you seem to be unusually familiar with aviation regulations." Captain Reynolds' tone shifted, a note of suspicion replacing the authoritative command. "Are you in the industry?" Alexis maintained her composed demeanor. "I'm familiar with passenger rights, Captain. Now, about that employee number, I'll need it to properly document this interaction." Reynolds exchanged glances with Gregory, who subtly shook his head. "What exactly are you documenting?" Reynolds asked, eyeing the journal. "Every aspect of this interaction," Alexis replied. "The time you approached me, your request that I relocate without specific cause, and your claim of operational necessity without citing applicable regulations." By now, most of the first-class cabin had fallen silent, passengers openly watching the exchange. From seat 3A, James Wilson shifted uncomfortably, closing his laptop. His eyes moved from Alexis to the captain, assessment in his gaze. "Look," Reynolds said, lowering his voice. "This doesn't need to become complicated. We're offering you an equivalent seat. In a different cabin class," Alexis interjected, "after I was specifically assigned this seat, while no other passengers are being asked to relocate." Elena Rodriguez approached cautiously. "Captain, the final pre-departure checklist." "Not now," Reynolds said sharply, not taking his eyes off Alexis. He took a different approach. "Ms. Turner, we respect your concerns, but flight crew instructions must be followed under federal regulations." "I understand federal regulations quite thoroughly," Alexis replied. 14 CFR 121.533 grants you command authority regarding safety of flight. It doesn't grant arbitrary authority to relocate specific passengers without documented cause. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "You're citing federal aviation regulations to me. I've been flying for 30 years. Then you'll appreciate the importance of following them precisely," Alexis replied, her voice cool as steel but equally unyielding. From across the aisle, James Wilson finally spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of an executive. "Is there an actual problem with the seat assignment? I've been a Transamerica Platinum member for 15 years, and I've never seen a captain personally request a passenger change seats after boarding." Reynolds glanced at Wilson, clearly not expecting another passenger to join the conversation. Sir, this is between the crew and Ms. Turner, Alexis supplied. Alexis Turner. Ms. Turner, Reynolds continued. We have procedures, which should be transparent, Wilson interjected. I'm curious myself now. What's the specific reason for this seat reassignment? The murmurs from other passengers grew louder. From behind, multiple voices complained about the delay. This is ridiculous, one man called out. Some of us have places to be. If she'd just move, we could leave, another added. Tyler Hammond stood up, his imposing figure looming in the aisle. Look, lady, you're holding up an entire plane. There are people with connecting flights and important meetings. Just take the business class seat and let us get going. Several passengers nodded in agreement. The social pressure was building. Sophia Diaz, who had been watching silently, spoke in a quiet but clear voice. Some things are worth being delayed for young men, like dignity. Gregory Palmer stepped closer. Captain, we're approaching departure time. Reynolds faced a decision point. The simple directive had evolved into a situation with multiple witnesses and explicit questioning of his authority. His face hardened. Ms. Turner, this is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily. Interfering with crew member instructions is a federal offense. Alexis met his gaze steadily. Requiring compliance with an unlawful directive is also a federal offense, Captain. I understand FAA Regulation 117.3 covers weight distribution concerns. Please cite the specific operational code you're implementing. The captain's momentary hesitation told Alexis everything she needed to know. There was no operational code because there was no legitimate operational necessity. Gregory leaned in, whispering something to Reynolds. The captain nodded sharply. Ms. Turner, Gregory said, adopting a conciliatory tone, perhaps we can offer you an upgrade to business class as a courtesy for the inconvenience. This isn't about courtesy, Alexis replied. This is about whether there's a legitimate reason I'm being singled out. The word singled hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone listening. Several passengers glanced away uncomfortably. Others watched with growing interest. James Wilson closed his laptop completely, now fully engaged in the situation developing beside him. I think the lady deserves an answer. What's the specific reason for asking her and only her to change seats? Reynolds' face flushed with barely contained anger. Sir, with all due respect, this doesn't concern you. It concerns everyone on this aircraft if crew members make demands without clear justification, Wilson replied, his initial discomfort now replaced with resolve. Around the cabin, the division among passengers became visible, some irritated by the delay, others concerned about the treatment they were witnessing. The college students' phones were now openly recording, no longer bothering with discretion. Captain Reynolds straightened his posture, his decision made. We'll discuss this further after takeoff, he said, turning abruptly and heading back toward the cockpit. But Alexis knew this wasn't over. It was merely the opening gambit in what promised to be a much longer confrontation. 20 minutes later, Transamerica Flight 847 remained at the gate. The ambient conversation had resumed, but with a different quality, hushed, speculative, occasionally punctuated by glances toward seat 3B, where Alexis sat outwardly composed while documenting every detail in her journal. Captain Reynolds' voice came over the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay in our departure. We're working to resolve a seating discrepancy. Your patience is appreciated. The implied blame wasn't subtle. Several passengers sighed audibly. Tyler Hammond made a show of checking his watch and shaking his head. This is costing me thousands, he announced loudly to no one in particular. I'll miss my connection to Tokyo at this rate. From across the aisle, a businesswoman in a sharp suit added, They should just remove whoever's causing the problem. One person shouldn't inconvenience everyone. The social pressure was building as Reynolds had likely intended. Alexis felt the weight of disapproving stares, but kept writing steadily in her journal. Elena Rodriguez moved through the cabin offering water to passengers during the delay. When she reached Alexis, she paused. "Ms. Turner," she said quietly, "the captain has asked me to remind you that compliance with crew instructions is mandatory under Code 7 protocols." Alexis looked up. "Code 7, I'm not familiar with that regulation. Could you clarify which federal aviation regulation that references—" Elena hesitated. It's an internal Transamerica protocol." "For what purpose specifically?" Alexis pressed. Before Elena could answer, Gregory appeared behind her. "That's proprietary airline information, ma'am. Elena, you're needed in the galley." As Elena retreated, Alexis made another entry in her journal. Internal codes without regulatory basis being used to enforce compliance, a pattern she'd documented at other airlines. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Reynolds emerged now accompanied by the first officer who remained by the flight deck while Reynolds approached Alexis's seat. This time the captain positioned himself to create a more imposing presence, standing directly in the aisle beside 3B, effectively blocking Alexis's path should she attempt to leave her seat. "Ms. Turner," he said, voice firm but controlled. "We've contacted Operations Control. They've confirmed the need for a seat reassignment based on special circumstances protocol." "Which specific protocol?" Alexis asked, pen poised above her journal. Reynolds ignored the question. "I'm exercising my authority under CFR Title 14 to implement security measures as necessary. You have two options. Accept relocation to business class or deplane for a later flight." The escalation was clear, no longer just a seat change, but now the threat of removal. James Wilson, who had been listening closely, shifted in his seat. "Captain," he said, "I'm not clear on what security concern a seat assignment could possibly raise." Reynolds turned slightly. "Sir, with respect, this doesn't concern you." "Actually," Wilson replied, "as a passenger on this aircraft, security protocols do concern me. I'm curious what security threat is posed by this woman remaining in her assigned seat." Alexis appreciated the intervention but kept her focus on the captain. "I'm not aware of any security protocol that would require a passenger with a valid boarding pass to change assigned seats without specific cause. Could you clarify the nature of this security concern?" Reynolds' posture stiffened. "We're not required to disclose security measures to passengers." "You are required to have a legitimate basis for them," Alexis countered. "Selective implementation of undefined security measures targeting specific passengers requires documentation." By now, other crew members had gathered near the front of the cabin. The college students in row 4 were openly recording on their phones. Throughout the aircraft, the mood had shifted from impatience to a tense awareness that something unusual was unfolding. Tyler Hammond stood from his seat again, moving into the aisle. "This is ridiculous. Captain, if she won't move, can't you just have her removed so we can get going? I'm going to miss a multi-million-dollar deal because of this obstinance." Several business class passengers had now appeared at the front of the cabin, drawn by the commotion. "What's the holdup?" one called out. "We've been sitting here for almost an hour." Reynolds seized the opportunity, addressing the growing chorus of impatient travelers. "As you can see, one passenger's refusal to comply with crew instructions is delaying everyone. We're doing our best to resolve the situation." The strategy was clear: turn passenger frustration against Alexis, creating social pressure to comply regardless of whether the directive was legitimate. Sophia Diaz rose slowly from her seat, her dignity commanding attention despite her small stature. "Young man," she addressed Hammond directly, "there was a time when people like me were regularly told to move to the back for comfort of other passengers. Would you have supported that too if it meant keeping your schedule?" Her words hung in the air, creating a moment of uncomfortable silence. That's completely different," Hammond sputtered, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Is it?" Sophia asked quietly. "Or is it just happening to someone else this time?" Hammond flushed, mumbling something inaudible as he returned to his seat. Captain Reynolds raised his voice slightly, ensuring it carried throughout the cabin. This delay is the result of one passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions. We apologize to everyone else for the inconvenience. The delay, Alexis responded, her voice equally clear, is the result of unexplained directives targeting a single passenger without legitimate cause. Reynolds leaned closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. You're bordering on interference with flight operations. That's a federal offense that can result in placement on the no-fly list. I have connections throughout the industry, Ms. Turner. This won't end well for you. The threat was explicit now and personal. Reynolds was no longer just citing authority, but making clear that consequences would extend beyond this flight. Alexis met the captain's gaze without flinching. Discriminatory practices in commercial aviation are also federal offenses, Captain Reynolds. Your choice of passenger for removal will be documented and reviewed. For a moment, neither spoke. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. From the front of the cabin, a Transamerica ground supervisor appeared, stepping hesitantly into the charged atmosphere. Captain Reynolds, the supervisor said, Operations is asking for a status update on our departure delay. Reynolds straightened. Tell them we have a non-compliant passenger situation. Security response may be required. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. As Captain Reynolds turned to speak with the ground supervisor, Alexis remained outwardly calm. Inside her mind calculated options and consequences with the precision that had made her both an exceptional pilot and an effective commissioner. This was the moment where many would capitulate the escalation to security response, and potential removal from the aircraft created powerful incentives to comply. The path of least resistance would be to take the offered business class seat and file a complaint later. But Alexis Turner hadn't become who she was by taking paths of least resistance. She opened her accountability protocol journal to a new page, writing with deliberate strokes that would be visible to anyone watching. At the top, she wrote, Official Record Discriminatory Enforcement Request, Flight 847, in clear capital letters. The college students' phones captured the moment. From across the aisle, James Wilson observed with undisguised interest. When Reynolds turned back toward her, Alexis was prepared. Captain Reynolds, she said, voice steady and clear enough to be heard by nearby passengers. Before you involve security, I want to clarify my position. I have not refused any legitimate safety directive. I have merely requested verification of the operational necessity that specifically requires me and only me to relocate from my assigned seat. She continued before he could respond. I'm documenting that at 7:43 p.m. you threatened potential placement on a no-fly list for requesting clarification of an unspecified directive. I'm also noting that no other passengers in first class have been asked to relocate despite several boarding after I was seated. Reynolds' expression darkened. You're not in a position to... I'm in precisely the position to document discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. Alexis interrupted, maintaining her composure. Now you have options, Captain. You can provide the specific operational or security concern that necessitates my relocation. You can acknowledge there is no such concern and allow me to remain in my assigned seat. Or you can escalate to security response, which will trigger a mandatory FAA incident review. She let the words sink in. Around them, the cabin had grown completely silent. I'm not responsible for delays caused by unsubstantiated demands, she added. That responsibility lies with those making such demands. Gregory Palmer stepped forward. Ms. Turner Transamerica has the right to assign seats as necessary for operational requirements. Correct, Alexis agreed. And such operational requirements must have documented justification when challenged. I'm challenging the justification for targeting me specifically. She turned a page in her journal. For the record, I'm noting that at 7:45 p.m., no specific operational requirement has been cited despite multiple requests for clarification. The ground supervisor shifted uncomfortably. Captain Operations is asking if we need to offload passenger baggage. We're now 20 minutes delayed. This was a critical moment. Removing a passenger's baggage would extend the delay significantly, something the airline would be reluctant to do without clear cause. Reynolds suddenly moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Alexis could hear. Listen carefully. I don't know who you are or what game you're playing, but I've removed passengers for far less than this. One call to security, and you'll be in an interview room explaining yourself to airport authorities. Is that what you want? The intimidation was blatant, now no longer cloaked in procedural language. Reynolds' face was inches from hers, his eyes cold with anger. Alexis didn't flinch or back away. Instead, she raised her voice just enough to ensure nearby passengers could hear her response. Are you threatening me, Captain Reynolds, because that would constitute intimidation of a passenger, which is a separate violation of FAA regulations? Would you like me to document that as well? From the row behind Tyler, Hammond stood again. Just get security all ready. Remove her, and let's go. But other voices had begun to join the conversation. A woman from row 5 called out, I don't understand why she needs to move if it's her assigned seat. One of the college students added, Yeah, what's the actual reason? No one's explained that. Alexis decided to shift the dynamic. Captain Reynolds, I understand you have an aircraft to command, and further delay impacts everyone on board. I'm prepared to assist in resolving this situation efficiently. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, perhaps sensing a capitulation. I'm invoking my right as a passenger to request documentation of any directive that singles out specific individuals. Alexis continued. If you can provide such documentation, I'll comply immediately. If not, I respectfully request to remain in my assigned seat so we can all proceed with our journey. The strategic reframing was subtle, but significant, placing Alexis in the role of reasonable problem solver rather than obstructionist. James Wilson cleared his throat. That sounds entirely reasonable to me. Either there's a legitimate reason that can be documented or there isn't. Several other passengers nodded in agreement. The tide was beginning to turn. Captain Reynolds found himself in a bind of his own making. Documenting a fabricated operational necessity would create a paper trail of questionable decisions. Acknowledging there was no necessity would expose the arbitrary nature of the original demand. Escalating to security without clear justification would trigger external review. His jaw worked as he considered his options. Finally, he turned to Gregory. Check if 7A is still available in business, he said quietly. It is, Gregory confirmed. Reynolds turned back to Alexis. Ms. Turner, as a courtesy to you and to avoid further delay for all passengers, I'll allow you to remain in your current seat for now. We'll address this matter after takeoff. The capitulation was wrapped in language suggesting it was a concession rather than a retreat, but everyone listening understood what had happened. Alexis nodded. Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your reconsideration. As Reynolds returned to the cockpit, the tension in the cabin shifted. Passengers exchanged glances, some with relief that the delay might end, others with lingering questions about what they'd witnessed. Alexis made one final entry in her journal, 7:48 p.m. Initial confrontation temporarily resolved. Captain retreated from demand but indicated for now, suggesting potential resumed confrontation after takeoff. She closed the journal and placed it in the seat pocket in front of her, visible and accessible. This was merely the first round. Experience told her the next would come once they were airborne, when the power dynamic would shift further in the crew's favor. As Captain Reynolds disappeared into the cockpit, the artificial quiet of the first-class cabin dissolved into a buzz of whispered conversations. The confrontation had transformed anonymous travelers into unwitting participants in a drama none had anticipated. James Wilson turned slightly toward Alexis. That was impressive, he said, keeping his voice low. Are you an attorney? Among other things, Alexis replied with a small smile. Wilson hesitated, then extended his hand across the aisle. James Wilson McKinsey Consulting. Alexis Turner. She shook his hand briefly. Look. He continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Whatever happens after takeoff, I saw this whole interaction. If you need a witness statement later, I'm willing to provide one." "I appreciate that, Mr. Wilson." "James, please." He paused. "I fly this route twice monthly. I've never seen anything like this." His demeanor had changed considerably from the initial moments of the confrontation when he'd seemed reluctant to get involved. Now there was something like admiration in his expression. "I've always considered myself someone who would speak up if I saw injustice," he admitted quietly. "But the truth is, I've witnessed questionable treatment on flights before and told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. Today was educational." "Witnessing matters," Alexis replied. "Speaking up matters more." Behind them, Tyler Hammond leaned forward, still visibly irritated. "Some of us are trying to conduct business here. Could you save the chit-chat for after we finally get moving?" Wilson turned. "Some things are more important than conference calls, sir." Hammond scoffed. "Easy to say when it's not your meeting being missed." He gestured toward his watch. 30 minutes delayed already because someone wants to make a point." From her seat, Sophia Diaz fixed Hammond with a steady gaze. "Young man, I've lived long enough to see what happens when people don't make points, as you call it. Sometimes principles matter more than schedules." "What would you know about it?" Hammond muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sophia's eyes flashed. "More than you might imagine, senor. In 1957, I was told to move to the back of a Greyhound bus in Texas despite having a ticket for my seat. When I refused, they removed me in El Paso and left me there with no way home to Los Angeles. I was 17 and alone in a strange city. So yes, I know something about the importance of standing one's ground." The personal story landed with unexpected impact. Hammond's face flushed and he returned to his phone without further comment. In row 4, the college students whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Alexis. One, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses, raised her phone subtly to capture the continuing reactions. "This is crazy," she murmured to her companions. "Transamerica just tried to move her for no reason." Her friend nodded. "Pretty obvious why they picked her and not the white guy beside her." "I'm posting this. People need to see it." Near the front of the cabin, a middle-aged white couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman leaned toward her husband. "Do you think we should say something?" "Not our business," he replied quickly. "Let's just stay out of it. But if no one speaks up—" "Martha, please, it's being handled. Let's not get involved." The divide among passengers grew increasingly evident, those willing to acknowledge what they'd witnessed versus those preferring to look away, those irritated by the delay versus those recognizing the importance of the principle at stake. A businessman who had been vocal about the delay earlier now appeared conflicted. He caught Alexis's eye and offered a small nod of something like respect. The social dynamics were shifting as passengers processed what they had observed. Elena Rodriguez moved through the cabin, ostensibly checking passenger comfort, but clearly monitoring the atmosphere. When she reached Alexis, she paused. "Ms. Turner," she said quietly. "We should be departing shortly. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" The professional courtesy in her tone suggested a subtle shift, perhaps recognition that the captain's approach had been questionable. "I'm fine, thank you," Alexis replied. "I appreciate your checking." Elena hesitated, then lowered her voice further. "I want you to know, that is, not all of us." She stopped, glancing toward Gregory, who watched from the galley. "Never mind. Please let me know if you need anything during the flight." As she moved on, James Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like dissension in the ranks." "Often is," Alexis replied. "Most airline staff want to do the right thing. It's usually a few who create these situations." The PA system crackled. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." The announcement triggered the usual flurry of activity: final checks of seat belts, securing of cabin items, closure of overhead bins. The confrontation temporarily receded beneath the routine of pre-takeoff procedures, but remained present in sidelong glances and whispered conversations in the tension that still permeated the cabin. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, nearly 40 minutes behind schedule, Alexis felt the weight of eyes upon her, some curious, some supportive, some resentful. The sanctuary of cruising altitude might bring temporary calm, but she knew from experience that the most difficult part of the journey still lay ahead. Elena Rodriguez had joined Transamerica Airlines 11 years ago, following her older brother's footsteps into aviation. The job had offered everything she'd hoped for: travel beyond her small hometown in Arizona, a steady income that helped support her parents, and a sense of purpose in ensuring passenger safety and comfort. Today, that sense of purpose collided with growing unease as she watched Gregory Palmer confer with Captain Reynolds in the forward galley. "The priority code flagging system is standard procedure," Gregory insisted, keeping his voice low. "We've been using it for years." "Not like this," Elena countered. "PC was supposed to be for actual security concerns or VIPs needing special handling, not for—" She hesitated. "Not for what?" Gregory challenged. Elena remembered her grandmother's stories about being moved to the back of restaurants in the 1960s, about having to enter through side doors, about the indignities, small and large, that had shaped her family's American experience. "You know exactly what I mean," she replied. "I checked the manifest myself. Ms. Turner was assigned 3B at booking. There was no upgrade, no last-minute change. And I've reviewed the weight and balance calculations. There's no distribution issue." Gregory's expression hardened. "You're overstepping, Rodriguez. The captain made a call. Our job is to support it, not question it." "Our job is passenger safety and adherence to regulations," Elena corrected. "What regulation justifies asking only her to move?" "Listen carefully," Gregory said, stepping closer. "This isn't about one passenger. This is about chain of command. If crew members start questioning captain's decisions, the whole system breaks down. You want that responsibility?" Elena thought of her mortgage, of her father's medical bills, of the security her job provided. She thought too of her grandmother, who had taught her that security purchased with silence eventually costs far more. "I want to do what's right," she said finally. Gregory's voice lowered further. "Transamerica has been good to you, Elena. 11 years right. Think about your future here. Reynolds has friends in corporate who determine schedules, routes, promotions. Cross him and you might find yourself on red-eyes to Anchorage for the next decade." The threat wasn't subtle. "You need to decide which side you're on," Gregory continued. "The cruise or some random passenger who's causing trouble." Elena looked down at her tablet at the priority code system displayed on the screen. What had begun as a tool for identifying VIPs and passengers needing special assistance had evolved into something else, a mechanism for classifying travelers based on whether they looked right for their cabin class, whether they matched unspoken expectations about who belonged in premium seats. She'd seen it happen gradually over the past 3 years, the code designations expanding beyond their original purpose. She'd noticed the pattern, had been uncomfortable with it, but had never formally questioned it. Like many, she'd told herself it wasn't her decision to make. "I need to complete the safety checks," she said finally, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with Gregory's ultimatum. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Elena moved through the cabin for final compliance checks. When she reached Alexis Turner's row, she noticed the journal in the seat pocket, Accountability Protocol, clearly visible on its cover. Something in that title resonated with a decision forming in Elena's mind. At the back of first class, she paused beside Sofia Diaz. The older woman looked up, recognition in her eyes, not of Elena specifically, but of what she represented. A younger Latina woman navigating institutional pressures, the kind of silent understanding that forms between those who've walked similar paths. "Abuela would be ashamed if I said nothing," Elena murmured almost to herself. Sofia nodded slightly. "Our silence has never protected us, mija." The aircraft engines increased in pitch as they approached the runway. Elena returned to her jump seat, buckling in beside Gregory, who watched her with narrowed eyes. "Whatever you're thinking, don't," he warned. "Reynolds already flagged this flight for headquarters review because of the delay. Everyone's performance is being evaluated." Elena said nothing, but her mind raced. The priority code system had begun 3 years ago, ostensibly to identify passengers who might need special handling, whether for service recovery after previous issues, high-value status, or security concerns. But over time, she'd noticed patterns in its application. Certain demographics seemed flagged more frequently. Certain crew members seemed to use the codes more aggressively. She'd never documented these observations, never formally questioned the practice. Like many, she'd rationalized it as not her decision to make, as something beyond her control. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, pressing her back against the seat. As they lifted into the darkening sky above New York, Elena made a decision that would alter the trajectory of more than just this flight. When the captain turned off the fastened seatbelt sign, she would review the flagging system documentation in the crew manual. She would note which specific priority code had been applied to Ms. Turner, and she would be prepared to act on that information when the inevitable mid-flight confrontation occurred. Gregory might be right about one thing: this was about more than one passenger, but not in the way he meant. This was about a pattern that had continued unchallenged for too long, and Elena's own complicity in that pattern through silence. As the aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet, the ding of the seatbelt sign turning off sounded like a starting bell. 45 minutes into the flight, a fragile normalcy had settled over the first-class cabin. Passengers sipped drinks, worked on laptops, or dozed beneath blankets. The earlier confrontation seemed suspended in the liminal space of cruising altitude, not forgotten, but temporarily set aside in the familiar routines of air travel. Alexis knew better. The quiet was merely intermission. She'd used the time to review notes from her congressional testimony preparation, occasionally making additional entries in her accountability protocol journal. Across the aisle, James Wilson alternated between work and watchful observation of the cabin crew. When Captain Reynolds's voice came over the PA system, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. Weather in Los Angeles is clear, temperature 72 degrees. We anticipate an on-time arrival despite our delayed departure." The emphasis on delayed departure wasn't subtle. "We're experiencing some minor crew coordination issues that may affect service timing. Your continued patience is appreciated." As the announcement ended, Gregory Palmer appeared at the front of the cabin. He conferred briefly with Elena, whose expression remained professionally neutral, though her posture had tensed. Gregory approached Alexis's seat with measured steps. "Ms. Turner, the captain has requested your presence in the forward galley to discuss the earlier seating matter." Alexis looked up from her tablet. "I'd prefer to have any discussion here with witnesses present. This is a private crew passenger matter." "There was nothing private about being publicly asked to change seats without cause," Alexis countered. "Any follow-up can occur in the same setting." Gregory's jaw tightened. "The captain insists. And I decline, which is my right as a passenger. If Captain Reynolds wishes to speak with me, he's welcome to do so here." From nearby seats, passengers watched the exchange with renewed interest. The college students' phones reappeared, recording discreetly. "Ms. Turner." Gregory's voice hardened. "This is becoming a matter of crew instruction compliance. The captain has authority over this aircraft under federal regulations." "Authority that must be exercised within legal boundaries," Alexis replied. "I'm not refusing communication. I'm refusing isolation." The distinction was critical, and everyone listening understood it. Gregory stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're creating a difficult situation for yourself. The captain has connections throughout the industry. This kind of resistance gets noticed. Do you fly often, Ms. Turner? Because after today you might find your travel experiences becoming significantly less pleasant." Bumped from flights, random security screenings, baggage delays, the industry has ways of dealing with problem passengers. The implied threat hung between them. Are you suggesting the captain would misuse his authority to retaliate against a passenger exercising her legal rights? Alexis asked, voice clear enough for others to hear. That would be concerning information to document. She opened her journal pointedly. Gregory straightened. I'm advising you that cooperation tends to produce better outcomes for everyone. I'm fully committed to cooperation within the boundaries of law and safety, Alexis replied. Now, does the captain have a specific regulatory reason for requesting I leave my seat mid-flight, or is this a continuation of the earlier unsubstantiated demand? The directness of the question left Gregory without easy response. Behind him, Elena approached with a tablet in hand. Gregory, she said quietly, Operations is requesting an update on the cabin situation. He turned irritation evident. Tell them everything's under control. They specifically asked about the priority code implementation on this flight. Elena continued, her eyes briefly meeting Alexis's. They're requesting confirmation of the security issue. Gregory's expression shifted. We'll discuss that privately. But the mention of priority code had caught Alexis's attention. The term connected to what she'd glimpsed earlier on the crew tablet. Captain Reynolds' voice came over the PA system again, this tone noticeably tenser. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a passenger compliance situation. We request all passengers remain seated while we address this matter. The announcement cast Alexis as the source of disruption, attempting to isolate her from potential support. Gregory seized the opening. Ms. Turner, you're now interfering with the safe operation of this flight. The captain has requested your cooperation multiple times. This is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily. Comply with what specific directive? Alexis asked, maintaining her composure. No legitimate safety concern has been articulated. We're experiencing a passenger compliance issue, Gregory repeated loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. If this continues, we may need to divert to the nearest airport and have you removed by airport security. The ultimatum was explicit now. Comply or face removal, potentially arrest. James Wilson spoke up. Excuse me, but I've witnessed this entire situation. There has been no disruptive behavior. Ms. Turner has simply declined to leave her assigned seat without explanation, which seems entirely reasonable. Sir, this doesn't concern you, Gregory snapped. It concerns everyone on this aircraft if crew members are making threats without clear justification. Wilson replied, his voice firm. I'm an executive with over 15 years of platinum status on this airline, and I've never witnessed anything like this. I'll be documenting this interaction as well. Around the cabin, a shift occurred. What had been individual observations coalesced into collective witness. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with Wilson's assessment. Sophia Diaz's voice carried clearly from her seat. I've seen this before many times. Different uniforms, same story. Even Tyler Hammond remained silent, no longer complaining about delays. From the row behind Alexis, a businessman who had been quiet throughout the journey finally spoke. I'm an attorney with the Department of Transportation, he said, his voice carrying authority. I'd be very interested to hear the specific regulatory basis for this ultimatum. The unexpected intervention created another dimension to the confrontation. Gregory's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the potential for escalation beyond what he or the captain had anticipated. Alexis looked directly at Gregory. I'd like to be absolutely clear about my position. I have not refused any legitimate safety directive. I have not caused disruption. I have simply requested clarification of why I specifically was asked to relocate when no other passengers were and declined to isolate myself for a discussion that began in public view. She took a breath, aware that the next words would irrevocably escalate the situation. If Captain Reynolds wishes to divert this aircraft to have me removed without legitimate cause, that is his decision. But I am exercising my right as a passenger under Federal Aviation Regulation 254.7 to request an immediate flight audit. The words fell like stones into still water ripples of reaction spreading across the cabin. "Flight audit," Gregory repeated, uncertainty crossing his features. "Yes," Alexis confirmed. "A flight audit, effective immediately." "A flight audit." Gregory Palmer's voice betrayed his unfamiliarity with the term. "There's no such procedure." Alexis remained composed, though she recognized the critical juncture the confrontation had reached. Around them, the cabin had gone completely silent, passengers straining to hear every word. "A flight audit," she repeated calmly, "is a passenger's right to request verification of all operational decisions affecting their journey, particularly those involving seating assignments or potential removal." She directed her explanation not just to Gregory, but to the entire cabin. The procedure was established following several civil rights-era incidents where passengers were removed from flights without legitimate cause. It requires documentation of crew decisions and verification of passenger assignments before a flight can legally continue. The college students in row 4 were typing frantically on their phones. One whispered to another, "I'm looking it up now. She's right. It's real." Gregory's uncertainty deepened. "I've been with Transamerica for 12 years. I've never heard of this." "It's rarely invoked," Alexis acknowledged. "But it remains a legal right under Federal Aviation Administration protocols, particularly when discriminatory practices are suspected." From his seat, James Wilson pulled out his phone. "I'm confirming this now. Yes, here it is. FAA Advisory Circular 12342B references passenger rights to request verification of operational decisions that appear to target specific individuals." Gregory glanced toward the cockpit, clearly unsure how to proceed. "I'll need to consult with the captain." "Of course," Alexis agreed. "The procedure requires captain acknowledgement and operations center notification." As Gregory retreated toward the flight deck, Elena Rodriguez approached, maintaining a professional demeanor, though her eyes conveyed something more complex. "Ms. Turner," she said quietly, "can you explain what happens during a flight audit for the crew's information?" Alexis recognized the request for what it was not just procedural clarification, but an opportunity to establish mutual understanding away from Gregory's presence. "A flight audit requires verification of all passenger seat assignments against the original manifest," she explained. "It also requires documentation of any special codes or flags applied to specific passengers along with the justification for such flagging." Elena's eyes widened slightly at the mention of flags and codes. Alexis continued. "The captain must provide written confirmation of any operational necessity claims, citing specific regulations. Ground operations must verify all weight and balance calculations. And any passenger who has been relocated or removed must have the specific cause documented in the flight record." She paused, allowing this to sink in. "Most importantly, the audit must be completed before the flight can legally continue to its destination. If discrepancies are found, they must be resolved or officially documented with passenger acknowledgement." Elena nodded slowly. "And this procedure, it's mandatory if requested?" "Yes," Alexis confirmed. "Under Federal Aviation regulations, once formally requested, the audit must be conducted. Failure to comply would constitute a regulatory violation." Around them, passengers were conducting their own research on phones and tablets, murmured confirmations spreading through the cabin. "It's real. Says here it was established in 1968. Specifically designed to prevent discrimination." The Department of Transportation attorney nodded to himself, a small smile playing at his lips as he watched the scene unfold. The cockpit door opened. Captain Reynolds emerged, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. He conferred briefly with Gregory, their voices too low to hear, though their body language spoke volumes. Reynolds gesticulating forcefully while Gregory appeared to be trying to calm him down. Reynolds approached Alexis's seat, visibly struggling to maintain professional composure. "Ms. Turner, there seems to be some confusion. I've been flying for 30 years. There is no such thing as a flight audit procedure. Alexis met his gaze steadily. Captain Reynolds, with respect, your personal familiarity with a procedure doesn't determine its existence. The flight audit protocol was established in 1968, following multiple incidents of discriminatory passenger removal. It's documented in FAA Advisory Circular 120-42B, Section 7, and referenced in Transamerica's own operations manual under Passenger Rights and Verification Procedures. The specificity of her citation clearly caught Reynolds off guard. He glanced at Gregory, who could only offer a shrug of uncertainty. Even if such a procedure exists, Reynolds countered, invoking it without legitimate cause could constitute interference with flight operations. The procedure exists precisely to determine whether there is legitimate cause for actions taken against specific passengers. Alexis replied, "If your request that I change seats was based on genuine operational necessity, the audit will confirm that. If not, it will establish that the request lacked proper justification." The logic was irrefutable. If Reynolds had acted appropriately, he should welcome verification. James Wilson leaned forward. "Captain speaking, as someone who's witnessed this entire situation, the audit seems like the appropriate way to resolve the matter transparently. If there was a legitimate reason for asking Ms. Turner and only Ms. Turner to relocate, the audit will confirm that." Other passengers nodded in agreement. The collective witness of the cabin had become a factor the captain couldn't easily dismiss. The Department of Transportation attorney spoke again. "I'd be particularly interested in the findings, Captain. This seems to be an optimal resolution that protects both passenger rights and operational integrity." Reynolds's jaw worked as he considered his options. Finally, he activated his communication device. "Operations, this is Captain Reynolds on Flight 847. I need verification on a passenger-requested procedure called a flight audit. Confirm whether this is a recognized protocol." The entire cabin waited in tense silence for the response. When it came, only Reynolds could hear it directly, but his expression told the story. The color drained slightly from his face. His posture stiffened. "Understood," he said tersely. "Stand by for further information." He looked at Alexis with newly assessing eyes. "Operations is confirming the procedure. They're checking the specific requirements." "Thank you, Captain," Alexis replied. "I appreciate your cooperation in resolving this matter properly." Reynolds turned to Gregory. "Contact ground operations at our next suitable airport. Tell them we may need supervisory personnel to board for a procedural verification." The implications were clear. Reynolds was considering landing to address the situation. Alexis remained unperturbed. "Captain, to be clear, diverting would not eliminate the need for the audit. In fact, it would expand the scope to include justification for the diversion itself." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "Ms. Turner, you seem remarkably familiar with aviation procedures for a typical passenger." "I believe in being informed about my rights," she replied simply. The dance continued, Reynolds probing for information, Alexis providing just enough to maintain her position without revealing her full identity. The power dynamic had shifted but remained delicately balanced. For now, the flight audit request had created a stalemate. The next move would depend on how quickly operations could provide guidance and how willing Reynolds was to proceed once he understood the full implications of the procedure he'd dismissed as non-existent. Captain Michael Reynolds had commanded aircraft for 27 years. He'd navigated hurricanes, handled engine failures, and managed medical emergencies. He'd earned the respect of colleagues and the trust of his airline. His authority in the cockpit was absolute and unquestioned. Until now. As he stood in the first-class cabin of Flight 847 facing a passenger who'd invoked a procedure he'd dismissed as fiction, only to have operations confirm its existence, Reynolds felt something unfamiliar uncertainty. "Operations, I need more specific information," he said into his communication device, turning slightly away from the watchful eyes of passengers. What exactly does this flight audit entail? The response from Transamerica's Operations Center came through his earpiece, audible only to him. Captain Flight Audit Protocol is indeed a recognized procedure under FAA oversight. It requires verification of all passenger seating assignments, documentation of any passenger flags or codes, and written justification for any operational decisions affecting specific passengers. Once invoked, it must be completed before the flight can proceed to final destination. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Who authorized this procedure? I've never encountered it in 3 decades of flying. It dates back to 1968, sir. It's rarely invoked but remains valid. The protocol was included in last year's regulatory update briefing. Reynolds vaguely recalled skimming that section, dismissing it as administrative trivia that would never affect actual flight operations. And if I determine this request is interfering with my command authority? A pause. Sir, declining a properly invoked audit would trigger mandatory review upon landing. The procedure was specifically designed to provide checks on command authority in potential discrimination scenarios. The implication was clear. Reynolds could refuse, but would face scrutiny regardless. He ended the communication and turned back to Alexis Turner, assessing her with new eyes. This was no ordinary passenger. Her knowledge of regulations, her composed demeanor under pressure, her strategic invocation of an obscure procedure all suggested someone with significant aviation background. "Ms. Turner," he said, struggling to keep his voice controlled. "Operations has confirmed the audit procedure. However, implementing it mid-flight creates potential safety concerns and would cause significant inconvenience to all passengers." "Safety should always be the priority, Captain," Alexis agreed reasonably. However, the audit was designed specifically to be conducted during flight to prevent diversions or delays based on questionable passenger removals. The procedure is streamlined for in-air implementation. Reynolds tried another approach. "This will delay service, inconvenience other passengers, and potentially affect our arrival time." From across the aisle, James Wilson spoke up. "I think most of us would prefer a slight delay to ensure proper procedures are followed." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The college students were still recording their phones, capturing every exchange. Reynolds felt the situation slipping further from his control. He leaned closer to Alexis, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "Who are you really, FBI FAA inspector? Some sort of corporate plant testing crew procedures?" The question revealed his growing realization that this passenger was not what she appeared. The certainty that had fueled his earlier confidence was crumbling. "I'm a passenger with a valid ticket who is asked to move without legitimate cause," Alexis replied calmly. "The audit will determine whether that request had proper justification." Reynolds straightened, frustration evident in his posture. His face flushed with barely contained anger. "Fine. We'll conduct your audit, but understand this will be thoroughly documented, and any interference with flight operations could result in consequences upon landing." "I welcome thorough documentation, Captain," Alexis responded. "That's exactly what the audit is designed to provide." The subtle shift didn't escape notice, Reynolds adopting a threatening stance, while Alexis maintained reasonable cooperation. Around the cabin, the contrast registered with watching passengers. Reynolds turned to Gregory. "Contact operations again. Tell them we need the full flight audit protocol transmitted to the aircraft immediately, and find out if there's any way to postpone this until landing." As Gregory hurried to comply, Reynolds addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a passenger procedure request, we'll be conducting a verification of our manifest and seating assignments. This may briefly delay normal service. We appreciate your continued patience." The announcement attempted to normalize the situation, but the tension remained palpable. Elena approached with a tablet. "Captain Operations has already transmitted the audit procedures. They're requesting your acknowledgement to begin the process." Reynolds took the tablet, scanning the document with growing disbelief. The protocol was more comprehensive than he'd anticipated, requiring verification of not just current seating, but the entire boarding process, any special codes applied to passengers, and written justification for any deviations from standard procedure. More concerning, it required Captain's signature on statements that could potentially expose the subjective nature of his original request that Alexis relocate. "This is absurd," he muttered, paging through the requirements. "Complete regulatory overreach." With each swipe of his finger, Reynolds' expression darkened. The audit would require him to document the specific reason for singling out Alexis Turner, a reason he couldn't provide, because it had been based on nothing more than Gregory's PC verification flag and his own snap judgment that she didn't match his mental image of a typical first-class passenger. Elena remained neutral. "Operations is standing by for your authorization to proceed, Captain." Reynolds glanced toward Alexis, who watched the interaction with calm attentiveness. He had severely underestimated this passenger, and now faced a decision: authorize an audit that might expose questionable practices, or refuse and trigger automatic review upon landing. Neither option preserved his authority intact. With visible reluctance, he pressed his thumb to the authorization box on the tablet. "Inform operations we're proceeding with the audit as required, and tell them I want a full review of how this procedure was implemented without proper captain notification and training." "Yes, Captain," Elena replied, taking the tablet. As she walked away, Reynolds fixed Alexis with a hard stare. "I hope you understand what you've initiated here. This isn't a game." "I assure you, Captain Reynolds," Alexis replied steadily, "I consider passenger rights and aviation safety protocols to be anything but a game." The captain returned to the cockpit without further comment, but the set of his shoulders conveyed his sentiment clearly. The battle lines were drawn, the audit would proceed, and the outcome would depend on what it revealed about the true nature of the operational necessity that had started this confrontation. 40 minutes after Alexis's invocation of the flight audit, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed. What began as a confrontation between one passenger and the flight crew had evolved into a collective experience, passengers no longer passive observers, but engaged witnesses to an unprecedented procedural challenge. The PA system crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to the ongoing procedural verification, we'll be making a brief stop in Denver to board additional personnel to assist with the process. This will delay our arrival in Los Angeles by approximately 1 hour. We apologize for the inconvenience." The announcement confirmed what Alexis had anticipated. Reynolds was attempting to regain control by involving ground personnel. It was a strategic decision, though not necessarily advantageous to his position. James Wilson leaned across the aisle. "Denver, is that normal procedure for this audit?" "Not typically," Alexis replied quietly. "The audit is designed to be conducted in flight by existing crew. This suggests the captain is seeking additional support or documentation. Or hoping to find someone who can override the audit requirement," Wilson suggested. "Possibly," Alexis agreed. "But that would only compound the regulatory issues." Across the cabin, passengers processed this latest development. Some sighed at the additional delay, others appeared intrigued by the unfolding drama. Tyler Hammond, who had been vocal earlier about the delay, now sat silently, his expression unreadable. Elena Rodriguez approached with the tablet. "Ms. Turner Operations has requested you verify receipt of the flight audit notification." She positioned the device to show Alexis the screen while ensuring nearby passengers couldn't view it. The document displayed was official Transamerica protocol confirming the audit would include verification of all passenger seating assignments against original manifest, documentation of any passenger flags or special codes, written justification for any crew decisions affecting specific passengers, operations, center oversight of the entire process. At the bottom was a notation: "Ground supervisor will board in Denver to ensure regulatory compliance." Alexis signed the acknowledgement. "Thank you, Elena." As Elena moved away, Gregory Palmer approached. His earlier confidence had diminished, replaced by a stiff professionalism. Ms. Turner, the captain, has requested I inform you that operations is transmitting all relevant documentation. The audit will be conducted in accordance with company policy. The careful wording suggested coaching from legal or operations personnel, a shift from confrontation to procedural compliance. I appreciate that, Mr. Palmer, Alexis replied. Will Denver ground personnel be conducting the audit or merely observing? 2 operations supervisors will board to oversee the process, Gregory confirmed. The audit itself remains the responsibility of the current crew under captain's authority. Around them, passengers followed the exchange with undisguised interest. The college students continued documenting everything, occasionally whispering among themselves. This is history, one murmured to her companions. Nobody ever challenges airlines like this. Look at this flight audit is trending on Twitter already. Someone must have Wi-Fi access. From his seat, the Department of Transportation attorney watched with professional interest, occasionally making notes on his tablet. The institutional significance of what was unfolding clearly wasn't lost on him. 45 minutes later, the aircraft began its descent into Denver. The mood in the cabin had shifted again from tension to anticipation. Every passenger now understood they were part of something significant, though few could articulate exactly what was unfolding. After landing, the aircraft taxied to a remote stand rather than a terminal gate. Through the windows, Alexis observed 2 vehicles approaching a stairs truck and a supervisor's car with Transamerica's logo on the door. Gregory made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen will be remaining on board during this stop. 2 operations personnel will be joining us to assist with our procedural verification. We anticipate being on the ground for approximately 30 minutes. The door opened and 2 individuals in Transamerica management uniforms boarded a tall black man with graying temples and a serious expression, and a younger white woman with clipboard and tablet in hand. Good evening, the man addressed the cabin. I'm Marcus Johnson, Regional Operations Manager. This is Sarah Winters, Regulatory Compliance Officer. We're boarding to assist with a flight audit procedure that has been requested. His gaze swept the cabin, pausing briefly on Alexis before continuing. This audit is a standard verification process to ensure all operational decisions have been properly documented. We appreciate your patience while we complete this requirement. The carefully neutral language suggested operations was taking the situation seriously, positioning the audit as routine rather than extraordinary. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit, extending his hand to Johnson. Thanks for coming out. This is an unusual situation. Let's discuss in the galley, Captain, Johnson replied, his tone professional but reserved. As they moved forward, Sarah Winters approached Alexis. Ms. Turner, I understand you initiated the audit request. Could you step to the rear of the cabin to provide your statement? We'd like to minimize disruption to other passengers. I'd prefer to remain at my seat, Alexis replied. The original issue occurred here in view of these witnesses. Consistency of location helps ensure accuracy of documentation. Winters hesitated, then nodded. As you wish. I'll need to record your statement regarding the circumstances that led to the audit request. Of course, Alexis agreed. From the galley, Reynolds' voice carried despite his attempt to keep it low. This is unnecessary escalation, Marcus. One passenger refusing a routine seat reassignment has now involved regional management and compliance. Johnson's response was measured. The preliminary report indicates the reassignment wasn't documented as routine, Michael. No operational necessity was logged before the request was made. That's administrative detail. Captains have authority. Within regulatory boundaries, Johnson interjected. You know this. That's why the audit procedure exists. Their conversation continued more quietly, but the dynamic was clear. Operations wasn't automatically supporting Reynolds' position. The institutional response was careful, measured, focused on documentation and compliance, rather than defending the captain's actions. Sarah Winters positioned herself beside Alexis's seat, tablet ready. Ms. Turner, please describe the circumstances leading to your audit request, including any relevant details about initial seat assignment and subsequent crew interactions. As Alexis began her precise chronological account, passengers throughout the cabin listened intently. The arrival of management personnel had legitimized the situation beyond what many had anticipated. This wasn't merely passenger complaint, it was formal procedural review with operational oversight. "I boarded with a confirmed seat assignment of 3B, Alexis explained. Approximately 20 minutes before scheduled departure, I noticed unusual crew activity regarding my seat, specifically Senior Flight Attendant Palmer and Flight Attendant Rodriguez consulting a tablet with what appeared to be a flag beside my seat number. Winters typed rapidly, documenting each point. "Was this flag verbally identified?" "Yes," Alexis confirmed. "I overheard Mr. Palmer refer to a code adjustment in 3B and mention PC verification while communicating with the captain." Winters's fingers paused briefly over the tablet. "PC verification?" she repeated, making a separate notation. "Please continue." Alexis detailed the subsequent events, Captain Reynolds's approach, his demand that she relocate without specific cause, his claim of weight distribution requirements that contradicted standard aircraft operations, and the escalating attempts at intimidation when she questioned the basis for the request. "After takeoff," she continued, "Mr. Palmer delivered an ultimatum stating that I must either meet with the captain privately or face potential removal at the next suitable airport. When I declined to be isolated and requested documentation of the specific operational necessity requiring my relocation, the threats escalated to potential placement on a no-fly list." Throughout this recounting, the power dynamic had shifted decisively. What began as an isolated confrontation had expanded to include institutional accountability. And as Alexis detailed the sequence of events that led to this moment, the implications extended far beyond one seat on one flight. From the galley, Marcus Johnson approached, having concluded his initial discussion with Reynolds. He listened to the final portion of Alexis's statement, his expression professionally neutral, but his attention focused. "Thank you, Ms. Turner," he said when she finished. "We'll now proceed with the formal audit process." Johnson addressed the cabin. "As part of the flight audit protocol, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of passenger seating assignments against the original manifest, along with documentation of any special codes or flags applied to specific passengers. We appreciate your continued patience during this process." His emphasis on special codes or flags suggested awareness of what the audit might reveal. The institutional representative wasn't merely observing, but actively engaged in uncovering potential patterns. Sarah Winters began systematically working through the passenger manifest, verifying each seat assignment against boarding records. Meanwhile, Johnson approached Elena Rodriguez. "Flight Attendant Rodriguez, I'll need access to the priority code system records for this flight. Please provide the crew tablet." Elena handed over the device without hesitation. "The system shows all flags applied during boarding and pre-flight procedures." Johnson reviewed the information, his expression remaining carefully neutral, though his posture stiffened slightly. "I see a PC verification flag was applied to seat 3B prior to boarding. What's the documented basis for this flag?" Elena glanced toward Gregory, who was watching from nearby. "There was no specific documentation entered, sir. The flag was applied during pre-flight review." "By whom?" Johnson asked. "Senior Flight Attendant Palmer initiated the flag," Elena replied. "It was subsequently verified by Captain Reynolds." Gregory stepped forward. "The priority code system is a standard tool for passenger management. It's used to identify potential service issues before they develop." "I understand the system's intended purpose," Johnson replied. "What I'm asking is the specific justification for flagging Ms. Turner's seat in this instance." Gregory hesitated. "It was a precautionary measure based on crew assessment." "Assessment of what specifically?" Johnson pressed. "What criteria triggered this particular flag? The question laid bare the heart of the matter. What assessment had led to Alexis being singled out when no documented service issues existed? Gregory's professional demeanor showed its first crack. It's a judgment call based on experience. Some passengers don't match the typical profile for their cabin class, which can sometimes indicate ticketing irregularities. Don't match the profile in what way? Johnson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Gregory looked uncomfortable. Various factors. Attire behavior, general presentation. Was Ms. Turner's ticket verified before the flag was applied? Not specifically, but was there any documented history of service issues with this passenger? No, but was there any specific behavior that triggered concern about her presence in first class? Gregory's discomfort was now visible to everyone watching. It was a proactive assessment based on standard practices. Johnson made several notations on his tablet. I'll need to review the complete history of PC verification flags on this route over the past 6 months to determine if these standard practices show any concerning patterns in application. The implication was clear. This wasn't being treated as an isolated incident, but as potential evidence of broader issues requiring institutional response. Throughout this exchange, Captain Reynolds had remained near the cockpit door, watching with evident tension. As Johnson completed his initial review, Reynolds approached. Marcus, this procedural review is disrupting our flight schedule. We need to proceed to Los Angeles. The audit must be completed before continuing to final destination, Johnson replied. That's regulatory requirement, not discretionary. Reynolds lowered his voice. This is becoming a spectacle. We could have handled this privately after landing. The procedure was invoked properly and must be followed completely, Johnson responded. The findings will determine appropriate next steps. As they spoke, Sarah Winters had completed her manifest verification. She approached Johnson with her tablet. I've identified several inconsistencies, she reported. 4 passengers were reseated during boarding without documentation of cause, yet Ms. Turner was the only one approached regarding her assigned seat, despite having valid boarding documentation. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear, selective enforcement of procedures that somehow applied only to certain passengers despite similar circumstances. Johnson nodded. Include that in the final report. We'll need statements from those passengers as well. The comprehensive approach demonstrated that operations was treating the audit with appropriate seriousness, not merely going through motions to satisfy procedural requirements, but conducting thorough investigation of what appeared to be concerning patterns in crew behavior. As the process continued, the atmosphere in the cabin reflected growing recognition of what was being uncovered. Passengers exchanged glances, some with undisguised interest in the institutional representative's methodical documentation of what many had observed less formally. Johnson approached Alexis again. Ms. Turner, based on preliminary findings, there appears to be no documented justification for the request that you relocate from your assigned seat. Would you like to make any additional statement for the official audit record? Only that I appreciate the thorough implementation of the audit procedure, Alexis replied. The process exists to ensure passenger rights are protected through transparent documentation rather than subjective assessment. Johnson nodded, making a final notation. He then addressed the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, the flight audit has been completed. The findings will be submitted to Transamerica regulatory compliance and FAA oversight as required. We'll be departing Denver shortly to continue to Los Angeles. Thank you for your patience during this procedure. The professional language belied the significance of what had occurred. This wasn't merely procedural verification. It was institutional acknowledgement of practices that could no longer remain unexamined. As Johnson and Winters prepared to depart the aircraft, Captain Reynolds approached for a final exchange. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "The audit findings will be processed according to regulatory requirements," Johnson replied. "I suggest you focus on completing this flight safely and professionally. Further discussion can occur after landing. The measured response conveyed institutional seriousness without prejudging outcomes, proper procedure, rather than premature conclusions. But Reynolds clearly understood the implications, his expression reflecting recognition that this incident would have consequences extending beyond Flight 847. As the operations personnel departed and the aircraft prepared to resume its journey, the cabin settled into contemplative quiet. What began as confrontation between passenger and captain had evolved into documented examination of practices that had previously operated without effective oversight. The power dynamic had transformed completely from captain's unquestioned authority to institutional accountability mechanisms that ensured such authority remained within appropriate boundaries defined by legitimate operational requirements rather than subjective assessment. As Flight 847 continued toward Los Angeles, Marcus Johnson and Sarah Winters reviewed their findings in the Denver Operations Center. Though no longer aboard the aircraft, their investigation was expanding based on patterns identified during the audit. Meanwhile, Elena Rodriguez approached Alexis's seat. "Ms. Turner," she said quietly, "may I speak with you briefly?" Alexis nodded, and Elena knelt beside the seat to maintain a semblance of privacy in the crowded cabin. "The priority code system you saw on our tablet, it wasn't always used this way," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When it was implemented 3 years ago, it was supposed to help identify passengers who might need extra assistance or had experienced previous service issues." Alexis listened attentively, allowing Elena the space to continue. "But over time, certain crew members began using it differently. They created unofficial subcategories, ways of flagging passengers who didn't look right for their cabin class or who might cause problems." "Based on what criteria?" Alexis asked, though she already suspected the answer. Elena's eyes conveyed what her professional position prevented her from stating directly. "Criteria that have nothing to do with safety or service and everything to do with assumptions." Alexis nodded, understanding completely. "Your PC verification flag was applied at the gate," Elena continued. "It's coded language for verify this passenger belongs in this cabin. But there was nothing to verify your reservation was confirmed your boarding pass valid. The flag itself was the problem." "How widespread is this practice?" Alexis asked. "It varies by crew," Elena replied. "Some, like Captain Reynolds and Gregory, use it regularly. Others ignore it entirely. I've been uncomfortable with it for a while, but—" She glanced toward the galley where Gregory watched them with narrowed eyes. "But speaking up carries consequences." Alexis finished for her. "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "Until now, there's never been a way to formally question the system without risking careers." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and discreetly slipped a folded napkin into Alexis's hand. "These are dates, flight numbers, and crew combinations where I've observed similar pattern flagging. It's been happening for at least 2 years. Alexis carefully tucked the napkin into her journal without examining it. "Thank you. This information makes a significant difference." "I should have spoken up sooner," Elena admitted. "My grandmother would be disappointed in me." "Speaking up at all takes courage," Alexis replied, "especially when systems are designed to discourage it." As Elena returned to her duties, James Wilson leaned across the aisle. "What was that about?" "Documentation of a pattern," Alexis replied quietly. "Evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of an established practice." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've flown this route dozens of times, always in first class. Never once been asked to verify I belonged there or change seats without cause. Makes you think, doesn't it?" "It does," Alexis agreed. "The differential treatment only becomes visible when you see who gets flagged versus who doesn't." From her seat, Sofia Diaz watched their conversation with knowing eyes. "Some things change their appearance but not their nature," she observed. "Different words, same purpose." The cabin settled into the routine of flight, but beneath the surface calm, something had fundamentally shifted. The audit had not just verified Alexis's specific experience, but had exposed a classification system operating beneath official policies, a mechanism through which subjective assessments could be applied without transparent documentation or effective oversight. As the aircraft entered California airspace, Captain Reynolds' voice came over the PA system. His tone was professionally neutral, the earlier confrontational edge notably absent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Los Angeles. Local time is 10:15 p.m. Weather clear, temperature 68 degrees. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The announcement contained no reference to the audit or its findings, a return to procedural routine that belied the extraordinary events that had unfolded during the journey. But everyone aboard understood that standard operations had been permanently altered by what had been documented and acknowledged through formal process. Near the front of the cabin, Gregory Palmer performed his duties with rigid efficiency, avoiding eye contact with Alexis or other passengers who had witnessed the audit. His earlier confidence had been replaced by professional detachment that suggested recognition of potential consequences following landing. Elena moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, her decision to provide documentation representing personal resolution of the conflict between institutional pressure and professional integrity. Whatever career implications might follow, she had chosen which values would guide her actions. As Flight 847 began its descent toward Los Angeles, the illuminated cityscape visible through the windows, Alexis reflected on the journey's extraordinary evolution. What began with one passenger refusing unjustified demand had expanded to include formal documentation of practices that had previously operated without effective challenge, creating possibility for addressing patterns affecting countless travelers beyond those who happened to share this specific flight. The illuminated screens of phones throughout the cabin suggested the story was already spreading beyond the aircraft passengers sharing their observations through social media and direct messages, transforming isolated incident into documented account that would continue expanding after landing. The discovery of the priority code system and its unofficial implementation represented more than procedural irregularity. It revealed structural mechanisms through which differential treatment could be applied without transparent documentation or effective oversight. The audit had made visible what had previously operated in institutional shadows, creating accountability that would extend far beyond Flight 847. As Flight 847 began its initial descent toward Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the terminal reflected the extraordinary reversal that had occurred aboard Flight 847. What had begun with airline executives and security personnel positioning themselves to manage a difficult passenger situation had transformed into something entirely different. Corporate representatives suddenly scrambling to address potential regulatory concerns identified by a federal commissioner they had unwittingly attempted to intimidate. Alexis Turner stood in the jet bridge surrounded by passengers who had witnessed the entire sequence of events from initial confrontation through audit to revelation of her official capacity. The college students continued recording their phones, capturing this final chapter of an unprecedented flight experience. Robert Calloway, Transamerica's VP of Customer Experience, approached with markedly different demeanor than he had displayed on the aircraft. Where minutes earlier he had projected authoritative confidence, he now exhibited careful professional deference. "Commissioner Turner," he said, "I want to personally assure you that Transamerica takes compliance matters extremely seriously. What occurred today appears to have been an unfortunate misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Alexis repeated, her tone measured but pointed. "Mr. Calloway, the audit findings documented a specific pattern of implementation regarding your priority code system. That pattern was confirmed by crew testimony and management verification. This doesn't appear to be a misunderstanding, but rather a concerning practice that warrants comprehensive review." Nearby passengers, including James Wilson and Sophia Diaz, had paused their departure to witness this exchange. Their presence served as both audience and implicit support, the collective witness that had formed during the flight, maintaining its solidarity even as they transitioned to ground. Of course, Calloway acknowledged, visibly uncomfortable with having this conversation in public view. We're already initiating an internal review of the system and its implementation. Internal reviews are valuable first steps, Alexis noted. However, given the nature of the findings, this will require formal regulatory assessment as well. The implications were clear. This would not be handled quietly through corporate damage control, but would involve official oversight with potential consequences for airline practices. Captain Reynolds and Gregory Palmer had emerged from the aircraft, standing at a careful distance while observing the exchange. Reynolds' expression suggested someone calculating professional fallout, while Gregory maintained rigid composure that barely masked evident tension. Thomas Mercer, the security director, who had boarded with Calloway, approached with tablet in hand. Commissioner Turner, I want to clarify that the security response was based on the captain's characterization of events which we now understand may not have accurately reflected the situation. The characterization itself is part of the pattern requiring examination, Alexis replied. When legitimate passenger rights are exercised, recasting those actions as security concerns represents troubling misuse of safety protocols. Mercer nodded, making notes on his tablet. We'll be reviewing all communications regarding today's flight as part of our assessment. From the growing crowd of deplaning passengers, Elena Rodriguez emerged, still in her Trans-America uniform, but now carrying her personal items, indicating her duty shift had concluded. She hesitated briefly before approaching the gathering. Commissioner Turner, she said, her voice steady despite evident nervousness. I want to confirm that I'm willing to provide official testimony regarding the priority code system and its implementation patterns across multiple flights. The public commitment made in front of airline executives, security personnel, and numerous witnesses represented significant professional risk. Yet Elena's expression reflected resolve rather than uncertainty, a decision made after careful consideration of potential consequences. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez, Alexis replied. Your perspective as a crew member will be valuable in establishing comprehensive understanding of these practices. Calloway's expression tightened slightly at this development. A crew member publicly offering testimony about internal practices represented potentially expanded liability and complicated any attempt to minimize the situation. Transamerica encourages all employees to participate fully in any review processes, he stated carefully, the corporate language a thin veneer over evident concern about what such testimony might reveal. At this moment, Captain Reynolds stepped forward, apparently determined to regain some control over the unfolding narrative. Commissioner Turner, he said, as captain of Flight 847, I want to emphasize that any operational decisions were made with passenger safety as the primary consideration. If there were communication issues regarding seating assignments, I take full responsibility for any misunderstanding. The careful wording attempted to reframe the situation as communication failure rather than discriminatory practice, misunderstanding rather than intentional action, operational decisions rather than unfounded demands, communication issues rather than pattern of targeting. Alexis met his gaze directly. Captain Reynolds, the audit findings documented that you requested I change seats without operational justification, applied a priority code flag without legitimate basis, attempted to isolate me for discussion multiple times after I declined to move, and ultimately suggested potential security designation in response to my exercising recognized passenger rights. She paused, allowing the comprehensive summary to register with all listening. That doesn't appear to be a communication issue. It appears to be a pattern of differential treatment, followed by escalating attempts at intimidation when that treatment was questioned. The direct characterization delivered without emotion but with precise detail left Reynolds without effective response. Around them, passengers who had witnessed these events nodded in confirmation. James Wilson stepped forward. For what it's worth, I observed the entire sequence of events, and Commissioner Turner's assessment aligns exactly with what occurred. Captain Reynolds specifically targeted her while allowing other passengers to select seats freely, then escalated when she questioned the basis for his demand. Sophia Diaz added her voice. I've seen this pattern many times across many years. The only difference today was that someone with authority to challenge it happened to be the target. The collective testimony further undermined any attempt to reframe what had occurred as mere misunderstanding or communication failure. David Lattimore, the Department of Transportation attorney, stepped forward. I'll be filing an official report regarding this incident. The priority code system as implemented appears to raise significant regulatory concerns regarding compliance with federal non-discrimination requirements. His professional assessment added another layer of institutional accountability. Regulatory framework beyond airline operations to federal oversight mechanisms designed to ensure compliance with non-discrimination regulations. Callaway, recognizing the deteriorating position, attempted to regain control of the situation. We appreciate everyone's perspective on today's events. Transamerica is committed to providing excellent service to all passengers without distinction. We'll be conducting a thorough review of both this specific incident and the broader implementation of our service protocols. The corporate response focused on future review rather than acknowledging current findings, reflected standard damage control rather than substantive engagement with the issues identified. Alexis recognized the pivot and addressed it directly. Mr. Callaway, discrimination doesn't become misunderstanding when you target someone with authority to challenge it. The concern here isn't just what happened to me personally, but what happens routinely to passengers without regulatory knowledge or institutional position. The fundamental point cut through attempts at corporate reframing. This wasn't about one incident with one commissioner, but about patterns affecting countless passengers who lacked the specific knowledge or authority Alexis possessed. Throughout the terminal, travelers paused to observe the unusual confrontation between airline executives and what appeared to be a federal official, many capturing photos or video on phones. What had begun as an isolated incident aboard one aircraft was now unfolding in public view, with potential to expand far beyond the immediate circumstances. Marcus Johnson, the regional manager who had conducted the audit in Denver, approached through the crowd, having apparently been contacted following the aircraft's landing. Commissioner Turner, he greeted her with professional courtesy. Our audit findings have been processed according to regulatory requirements. I wanted to assure you personally that Transamerica takes these matters with appropriate seriousness. His institutional voice representing management accountability, rather than mere corporate damage control, added significant weight to the emerging consensus that this situation reflected structural issues rather than isolated misunderstanding. A woman pushing through the crowd caught everyone's attention. Jennifer Morales, Transamerica's Director of Customer Experience, whom passengers recognized from her brief appearance aboard the aircraft, now accompanied by a distinguished older man in an impeccably tailored suit. Commissioner Turner, the man said, extending his hand. I'm Richard Dunham, Chief Legal Officer for Transamerica. I understand there have been concerning findings regarding our priority code system implementation. I'd like to assure you that we're initiating comprehensive review of these practices immediately. The appearance of the airline's senior legal representative transformed the dynamic, yet again indication that corporate leadership recognized the potential significance of what had been documented rather than attempting to minimize it through mid-level management response. We would welcome your insights as we conduct this review, Dunham continued. Your expertise in both aviation operations and regulatory compliance would be invaluable in ensuring our practices align with both legal requirements and ethical standards. So, the invitation represented significant evolution from initial attempts at intimidation to recognition that addressing identified patterns required substantive engagement rather than defensive posturing. I'll certainly provide appropriate regulatory guidance, Alexis replied. The findings from today's audit will be processed through official channels with recommendations for addressing the concerning patterns that were documented. Throughout the terminal, the reversal had become complete, from security personnel positioned to manage difficult passenger to corporate leadership engaging with Federal Commissioner regarding potential compliance issues requiring institutional response. Elena Rodriguez stood slightly apart, her expression reflecting complex emotions as she witnessed this extraordinary conclusion to what had begun as routine flight assignment. Her decision to provide documentation had contributed significantly to institutional acknowledgement that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incident or subjective complaint. As the crowd began to disperse, Alexis addressed the passengers who had witnessed and supported her throughout the journey. Thank you all for your willingness to stand as witnesses. What we experienced today reflected patterns affecting countless travelers who lack the knowledge or position to challenge them effectively. Your documentation makes significant difference in establishing that these aren't isolated incidents, but structural issues requiring comprehensive address. Her acknowledgement recognized the coalition that had formed during the flight, not merely supportive individuals, but collective witness to concerning patterns that typically remained unchallenged due to power disparities between passengers and crew authority. James Wilson shook her hand. This was illuminating. I'll never view airline operations the same way again. Sophia Diaz embraced her briefly. You did what many couldn't. The difference wasn't just your position, but your willingness to use it for others beyond yourself. The college students approached with evident excitement. Commissioner Turner, our documentation has already reached hundreds of thousands through social media. People are sharing similar experiences from different airlines. It's becoming a movement. Their digital amplification confirmed what Alexis had suspected, that this incident would expand far beyond specific circumstances to broader conversation about practices affecting countless travelers throughout commercial aviation. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, Alexis found herself face to face with Captain Reynolds one final time. The earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by recognition of potential consequences following formal documentation of his actions. Commissioner, he said quietly, I want you to understand that I never intended— Intent isn't the issue, Captain, Alexis interrupted. The priority code system created mechanism for implementing subjective assessments without transparent documentation. That mechanism enabled concerning patterns regardless of individual intentions. Her response focused on structural issues rather than personal culpability recognition, that addressing these patterns required institutional change beyond individual accountability, though that accountability remained necessary component of meaningful response. As Reynolds moved away, the reversal was complete. What began with Captain demanding passenger move had transformed into Federal Commissioner attempted to exercise authority, now facing accountability for how that authority had been used. 8 months after the flight audit incident, as it had come to be known throughout the industry, Alexis Turner stood at the podium in the Federal Aviation Administration's auditorium. Behind her, a screen displayed the Turner Protocol ensuring equitable treatment in air travel. The room was filled with aviation executives, regulatory personnel, industry journalists, and passenger rights advocates, representatives from every stakeholder group affected by the comprehensive reform package being unveiled. The Turner Protocol establishes 3 fundamental principles, Alexis explained. Transparent documentation of all passenger classification decisions, statistical monitoring of implementation patterns to identify potential disparities before they become established practices, and accessible accountability mechanisms, ensuring all travelers can effectively exercise their rights regardless of specialized knowledge or institutional position. The protocol wasn't merely regulatory response to isolated incident, but comprehensive framework addressing patterns that audit had revealed operating throughout commercial aviation. It transformed what began as one passenger's refusal to accept unjustified treatment into industry-wide improvements, benefiting millions of travelers who would never know the specific circumstances that had initiated changes enhancing their experiences. In the audience, Elena Rodriguez, now serving as special advisor to the Passenger Rights Division of the FAA, watched with professional satisfaction as the principles she had helped document became formal regulatory framework. Her career had taken an unexpected turn from flight attendant observing concerning patterns to key contributor in developing accountability mechanisms addressing them. James Wilson had traveled from New York specifically for this announcement, his business experience providing valuable perspective during development process. His presence represented continued commitment to ensuring passenger rights extended beyond policy documents to actual implementation affecting travel experiences. As Alexis concluded her presentation, she recognized the extraordinary journey from that initial confrontation to comprehensive industry reform. What began as one passenger refusing unjustified demand has evolved into protection mechanisms benefiting all travelers. The protocol ensures rights exist in practice, rather than merely policy creating accountability accessible to everyone, regardless of specialized knowledge or institutional position. The transformation was complete from isolated incident to catalyst for meaningful improvement affecting countless passengers beyond those who happened to share that extraordinary flight. The journey to justice had begun with one woman who refused to move when told to do so without cause, and now extended to millions who would benefit from the protections her stand had created. The true legacy of Flight 847 wasn't just addressing one instance of discrimination, but establishing framework ensuring all passengers could travel with dignity, receiving treatment based on legitimate operational requirements, rather than subjective assessment or unacknowledged bias. What started with two simple words, "No, I am in my assigned seat," had become industry-wide transformation, ensuring everyone could remain in theirs without facing unjustified demands to move. And sometimes that's exactly where real change begins, when someone says, "I belong here." If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content that highlights the importance of standing up against discrimination. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that can change perspectives and inspire action. Have you ever witnessed or experienced similar situations? Share your thoughts in the comments below and help us create a community dedicated to dignity and justice for all. Thank you for watching.